Okay, so thank you to everybody for joining us this afternoon for this session. This is with Gary Aubin, and he has just written this rather wonderful book which describes everything for us, I think, being the lone SENCO, but the subheading goes for me, questions and answers for the busy SENCO. All those questions that we ask in the Facebook, I actually think Gary must be lurking in our Facebook group, having a look at all the questions we ask and then scribbling it all down before he wrote the book. I'm not sure, maybe he'll tell us that in a moment. So I'm going to pass straight over to Gary, who is going to take hold of today's session. Thank you very much, Gary.
Thank you so much, Abigail. I've plugged my laptop in just in time. That would have been a really awful start. There we go. Thanks. Thank you everyone for joining this afternoon. I suspect people are all coming off enormously busy and hectic days, and what a time to be a SENCO, when attendance is way lower than we expect because of COVID. Staff regularity of staff is way lower. Ability to get staff in at short notice is much harder. The ability to recruit staff seems to be much harder. So without wanting to start on an enormous negative, just thank you for making the time to be here this afternoon. Whenever I start a session, like, within my day job, when I start a session such as this, I'll say, please prioritize your own professional development and try not to be doing it alongside other things, but try and, you owe it to yourself. But actually, if people are doing it alongside the odd quick email or someone runs into your office, I won't know, and I won't think any less of you, I promise. So just to introduce myself, so my name's Gary Aubin. I'm a secondary drama teacher, and I was a head of year in a school and taught drama for many years. And then this thing came up, said we need a SENCO. In a school I was doing a maternity cover in at the time, said, we're looking for a SENCO. I thought, that sounds, interesting. And I think, as the case of many SENCOs, started without a Scooby-Doo, without a fraction of the knowledge I needed to have in order to do the job well. And I wonder if that's something that is echoed amongst others. Abigail, am I right that the chat's just sort of open? I'd love to see people's, thumbs up or me too, or actually that's awful, Gary, what were you thinking? Whatever else people want to, please do.
Emojis are on, so
yeah, okay. Thanks, thank you. So, and I just thought that my experience probably wasn't uncommon of starting in the role and not having a clue. And I remember going to an assistant head teacher's English class to go and see what was going on, and going, how on earth am I supposed to feed back to this chap who's much more senior than me and more experienced than me and is a really good teacher? And on reflection, I should have just gone, that was brilliant, thanks. But actually at the time I felt a real sort of insecurity at not knowing the answers, not knowing what I should be telling him about how to improve his practice. Anyway, so I became the SENCO and then did that for a number of years, and then became the school I was working in is in a trust. So then started working across this trust of schools, trying to work with primary and secondary mainstream SENCOs working in the schools in our trust. We've got 3 additionally resource provisions, but we're mainstream schools. And I'm seconded 2 days a week to the Education Endowment Foundation. So my other role at the moment is shouting loudly about the EEF's SEN in Mainstream Guidance Report. Please take a look at it if you haven't. I think it's got some useful things in it. It came out in March 2020 when, of course, schools and no one was thinking about how can we get slightly better at this, because, of course, this pandemic got going. So I've never done one of these before, if I'm honest. It's the first time I've done something as audacious as writing a book. I'm really pleased with lots of the lovely feedback I've had so far, and so thank you for anyone who's shared that with the group on Facebook that I do stalk occasionally. Abigail's absolutely right, or on Twitter or Amazon or whatever. So thank you in advance. And I don't always speak quite like this. I'm quite croaky. Not COVID, testing daily, not COVID. But anyway, so in this session, as I said, I've never done one of these before, but in this session I'll talk a bit through, I hope I'm not preaching to the converted, but I'll just highlight some of the bits that I think are useful in the book, and then I'll go into a few of the answers and try and provide something that isn't necessarily in the book, or embellish upon it, so that if people have it, it's not just me talking about things that you already know. Okay, so the rationale first. I'm trying to do this without any self-indulgence, so apologies if I move into self-indulgence, but just explaining why I wrote the book. So there's lots of books out there around SEND and the SENCO role, and lots of them are fantastic, and I mean no criticism of any of them. In my experience, there was a bit too much blue sky thinking. Try and imagine your department as this, whatever, or and actually it was really good at helping you to think of the bigger questions. but actually operationally and day to day, and what the hell do I do about this? Intervention, child, parent, local authority. I found them to be lacking there, and that's the gap I was trying to fill of going. If you read the Lone SENCO, there's some bits that you might be able to describe as a bit more strategic, big thinking, blue sky thinking, but most of it is, what do I do about this? And then I give an answer where there is an answer, or I acknowledge this is why it's not quite a clear answer, but this is the best I can give. And then the other reason for writing the book was because, as the title suggests, who do you ask? Who are you supposed to get? The anecdote I tell is that, well, anecdote's a bit grand, but if you're a French teacher, you're managed by the head of French, who teaches French and knows about French and can support you in your teaching of French. But if you, excuse me, if you're the SENCO, you're line managed by probably the head or assistant head, deputy head, and they may well know much less about SEND than you do. I feel there are two things that sometimes feel a bit discrete. One is SEND, and the other is the SENCO role. Those things don't always seem to be one and the same. But your line manager may well know a lot about one or the other, but probably not both. And perhaps neither. So it was the who do you ask that I wanted to provide something for people. It's the fact, as I've said, that people are thrown into the role that now you're the SENCO. It's a whole school role. You have responsibility for leading on SEND in our school, and you couldn't, hand on heart, talk with any confidence about what speech language communication needs means, let alone the 1,000 other things you're expected to know. And you're too busy to find out for yourself. There's an enormous amount you need to know, and you haven't got time to look at 20 different books, websites, government documents, or to read the whole code of practice and come back to it regularly. So I wrote the book for those reasons, and I really hope that it's supporting SENCOs in some of the ways that I hoped it would. The process, it was a lot of, so in my job that I've had for the last 3-4 years, is working across a trust. So it's working with SENCOs, and often new SENCOs who will say, I don't know anything about this. And then so I sort of reflected on what are those questions that come up. I like to think the book is useful for not just brand new SENCOs, but welcome comments in the chat about whether that's true or not. But I try to just think, what are the questions that I get asked lots that I often knew the answer to, sometimes didn't, but what are the things that new SENCOs especially need to know, and that actually all SENCOs would benefit from knowing. I did some reading and researching. I stole from things I'd done in my when I was a SENCO, and I've worked largely as a secondary SENCO, but also as a primary SENCO. So lots of stealing from myself, borrowing from people I work with closely, and then reading and researching. And it started as a Google sheet on my phone, where every time I was sort of couldn't sleep or was on the tube or whatever, it would be, this is a good question. And I came up with a list of about 300 odd questions that I slowly just grouped into themes. And it really started, there's probably a good month or two of just coming up with the questions before I get to writing any of the answers. So yeah, there was a lot of just coming up with questions, getting to about a 300 number and then going, I think it's ready to start taking shape now. Tapping away at ungodly hours. I had this idea that if I tapped quite quietly, I could be in bed next to my wife while she's still sleeping, and at 5:45 or 6 in the morning or something, and I could do half an hour, 40 minutes work without waking her. And this lasted for a week or so until she said, that I'm awake then when you're doing that. So I then had to find a duvet and take it downstairs to the sitting room and tap away. But yeah, it was lots of squeezing it in between other roles. What I thought I'd do now is just whiz through some what I hope are handy sections in the book that, again, SENCOs may not have the time or inclination or energy, whatever, to look through, and hopefully I've done some of that work for really busy SENCOs. So one thing I've done is look outside of SEND research in particular. There's a book called The Science of Learning, 77 Studies That Every Teacher Should Know. It's absolutely brilliant. I recommend it highly. I think they've got a re-released with more than that number of studies that every teacher should know. But it talks about motivation and praise and resilience, and it reminds me that often within SENCO the answers aren't deeply technical often, but also the answers aren't deeply SEND specific often. You don't need to be a qualified speech and language therapist to think about what motivates a child, but also it's not always totally common sense either. So I've got some questions in the book that are related to things that feel very relevant to the difficulties that we may have with some students with SEND, not all. but actually are really interesting and I hope useful. Things around praise, for example, and comfort focused feedback, where we want to say, it's okay, not everyone's good at maths. That's all right, you got 2 out of 50, don't worry, you do better next time. And actually what we are saying is, it's okay, I still value you, but what is being heard, so this research says, is you think it's okay that I did badly, and implied in that is you think I can't do well at maths, let's say. Likewise, so that's sort of comfort focused feedback when students don't do so well in something, but when they do well as well, going brilliant, you've always been great with poetry. Actually, that doesn't help either. We should be praising the strategy someone used in order to be great that time with poetry, rather than that sort of fixed mindset. So try to deal with some things outside strictly of SEND. I then got this section, which is what shall I do, which I really hope is like, I'm stuck. Oh, thanks, Abigail, that's very kind. The link is in the chat if anyone hasn't seen that. What shall I do? So often it'll be the teacher that grabs you in the corridor and says, this child won't. And it may be that the child can't. So I've got this section, which is, you know, a child can't self-regulate, stimming in class, no one wants to play with them. I've tried to think of quite sort of everyday scenarios that they're not all a problem in and of themselves, but they will be brought to you as problems. The child who is stimming in class, that'll be brought to a SENCO as a problem, and it's for you then to be able to give good feedback and advice to that teacher. And many people on the call will be expert beyond me at being able to do that, but I know that I couldn't have done that in my first year or two, particularly as SENCO. Child won't talk in class, won't enter a classroom, etc. So and last one there, what should I do for a child who's in hospital? You know, how did SENCOs find out that? So that was frustrating for me. Someone's on a long-term sort of hospital stint, and we're left to hopefully find the relevant DfE guidance about supporting students who are too ill to attend school. But actually, lots of SENCOs don't have the time or headspace or inclination to go looking for these things. So hopefully that's useful, and it's a bit of what you have to do and a bit of what's really nice to do, and there's no legal sort of guidance that says that you should, but it will probably help the child feel better. Okay. QR codes, I've had some really positive feedback about the fact it's got QR codes in it, and that sort of makes the Google, that makes the search for things a little bit less time consuming, I think. Some legal complexity. So, you know, there's just a sort of horribly murky and complex world, isn't there, around SEND? Oh, thanks, Ruth. That's very kind. I've never truly understood it myself. It's been a great bit of PD for me just going through this process, because it's like, okay, let me just quite work out this question myself. These are some of the questions. And that first one there, I think, is not the ethos that any of us want to go into. We don't go into being a SENCO with that in mind. I want to say no to children. I want to not admit children. That's not what we're about. But it is a realistic question that your head teacher might come to you, or it may well occur to you, actually, we're a mainstream school, like, just worry about what we'll provide for them. So actually, what's the legal basis? What's the process there? So that's what I've tried. And this went through IPSI as well. So I sort of did my research, wrote my answers, and was pretty pleased with myself. And then it was David Bartram who very helpfully said, you need to be a bit careful here. And he was absolutely right. And I went to IPSI and gave them a bit of a donation in order to, you know, have a couple of hours of someone's time very generously to have a bit of back and forth. And then the difficulty of me was going, they're saying, like I understand there's a bit more complexity to what I'd initially written, and but in some cases there's a huge amount of extra complexity, and actually as SENCOs it's not always possible to or useful sometimes to be taking all of that in. You're not being trained to be SEND lawyers, SEND legal experts even. So, you know, there's a certain working knowledge that's needed, and then it's about knowing, well, actually, what do I want to do beyond that to trying to give SENCOs what they need to know and a little bit more without having people to feel too bogged down. So I've tried to give the answers there as concisely as I can while capturing some of the complexity around SEND and the law. Exam access arrangements is a right pain, I find. I'm talking to secondary colleagues here particularly about this. Primary, I think it's, you know, it's much more workable, but as secondary, I find it to be a right pain, and it's a pain where the hours that it needs outweigh the benefit that it gives. If you think of where SENCOs could be in and around classroom supporting teachers, but instead they're filling in endless Form 8s and doing endless testing, getting the assessor in and collecting evidence, and you know, things that have a place because that child might really benefit from that extra 25 minutes of of time in their English exam, but they'll probably benefit from you helping their teacher to teach them English better for 2 years as well. So that's why I find them a pain, which people may well disagree with me on that, and I welcome that. But I've just tried to shortcut with what evidence is needed on each of those, and that's what in there. For a prompter, for example, okay, no paperwork's needed, don't need to do a Form 8, don't need to do an access arrangements online application. Those things should be quite helpful, I think. Thanks, Kate, for that. That's really sweet of you to say, so thank you so much. And Abigail, thank that book around, I don't know that book, thank you, around SEN and legal things. Thank you. Ofsted, I cover Ofsted a bit, which obviously is on all of our radars to some degree, and hopefully informs you to be able to go to colleagues and help them to ask the right questions and to know the right answers around SEND. Improvements to teaching and learning. So again, it's not, as a SENCO, no one goes out of their way to tell you these things, but I think they're essential. I've said this a few times before, apologies if you've heard me say this before, but on day 1 in September of Inset Day, the teaching and learning lead might stand up and say, this is great teaching. On day 2, the SENCO stands up in front of the on an Inset Day and says, this is great teaching for SEND. And then teachers are left going, well, is it that or is it that? And actually what I've tried to do here is make sure that SENCOs were as informed as possible about what great teaching is and where that overlaps with evidence, and then from that to go, okay, what does that look like for SEND in particular? So if we're thinking about dual coding, I think that there is a school of thought and some evidence to suggest that that's useful universally. And then I think I talk briefly in the book about why it's particularly useful, why we can see that that's useful for SEND. And then it's about, right now, what might we do with that as a SENCO? And some things are a bit more SEND specific, like seating plans, for example, and what considerations there are when you're advising teachers about their seating plans. Because what you won't have the time to do is to look at 20 different seating plans and treat it like a game of chess for each one of those. But what I've tried to do is have 3, 4, 5 sort of principles that will probably be quite useful for students to send in your school, and then for then teachers to take that on. And what I've hoped is that with that, people can just copy that out or take a photo of it, pop it in an email. These things that become time savers for you. I hope so. Lisa, that's really kind of you. Thank you for that comment there. I'll talk a bit about parent partnership. I'll go talk a bit more about that in just a moment. Using trainees, again, I'll talk about this in a moment, but I think that's really, I hope that's really helpful. I feel it is. It's sort of, what freebies can we get? Now that's slightly simplifying it, but we all need a freebie where we can get one. So I'll come back to that in a moment. Benchmarking against national averages. Now, we don't, it's not always helpful to benchmark against national averages because often cohorts of students with SEND are really cohort specific, aren't they? And in a one form-entry primary school, well, 2 out of our 3 students are going to get to age-related expectations, so that's 67%. Well, that's a bit of a nonsense number when the numbers are that size. And age-related expectations might be totally silly, daft for some kids, but they're making great progress, but that's the wrong benchmark. So sometimes it's handy, but it's better to know than not know. And where your data is above national average, then that's certainly nice to shout about. So so these are some of the questions there that I answer about the national context, and being able to talk about what's the national percentage of children with SEND, what's the most prevalent type. All good things to know in your conversations with head teachers, governors, other SENCOs, whatever. Making sense of data as well. So I've tried to give some guidance around, especially for the data phobes, and there are many of us, aren't there, data phobes, to sort of go, what do I need to know, and how can I make sense of it, and what then therefore might I do with it. And then in the back of near the back of the book, it's got a really oversimplified version of different needs, but it's what I needed and couldn't find when I started as a SENCO. So I hope it's got a role without oversimplifying and without pretending that every child with, for example, a speech language communication need is exactly the same. But what I've tried to do is just, if someone is struggling, and I've got sections here around Down syndrome, Tourette's, things that are slightly lower incidence, and some SENCOs, it could be a few years into the role and not have had experience with some of these things, just a 1-page-ish summary where what it is, how that might impact upon the classroom, what a few strategies might be, where to get some more information. Someone famous, if you want to put a poster of them and there's their name and a quote in the book, put it on a notice board or something, and then also how it's identified and interventions that might be useful. So with some caveats there around, you need to know your individual learner, look at the reports for that individual if they exist. I think it's a really useful sort of way to swat up on a wide range before going into detail where you need to for particular individual needs. At the back, lastly, there's a full list of questions, and in the reprint of the book, I've asked them to put the page numbers there just to make it slightly easier to navigate the page number by each sort of chapter. But yeah, at the back, a full list of questions, so you don't need to go, you can go a bit quicker to the thing you need particularly. I've had some of this already, which is lovely, but it would be great to know, because I've had some lovely feedback, which is quite generally of thanks, really helpful. It'd be lovely to have through particular sections of questions that are useful, because I've just run through the ones that I think are useful or would have been useful to me. But I'd love to hear if it's, oh yeah, this I've used already, or this I intend to use. And then any questions you'd wish had been answered. I think it's the kind of book that will probably need an update every so often, because things like the exam access arrangements and guidelines change every year. The statistics in it change a bit every year, don't they? So they will, and I've already sort of written, I've got 5 or 10 questions extra that I keep putting on my Google sheet to go, oh yeah, and this and this. So if there are suggestions for things that you've used that seem helpful, or questions that you'd like to have in there that aren't, I'd love to hear them in the chat if that's okay. Thanks. So I thought in the next little section, I'll just explore a few of the answers. So I've gone through some of the questions and why I think it's useful, but just to zone in really on a couple of the answers. So I talk in the book about meeting parents 3 times a year and how that can be done in practice. Excuse me, sorry, I'm trying to uncroak my throat a bit. So, and if you are a secondary SENCO, you might have an SEM register of over 100 students, and that can feel quite unworkable and can be quite unworkable. And the SENCOs I've worked with generally do a couple of things. In that case, they either don't meet with parents 3 times a year, or meeting parents 3 times a year is all they do. So that neither of those are correct. Neither of those are workable. So one of the first things I address is whether it needs to be you, and as you may well know from the code of practice, it doesn't need to be you as SENCO meeting with parents 3 times a year. According to the code of practice, it needs to be a teacher. Sorry, I beg your pardon. It says it should be a teacher with an understanding of that child's needs and provision. So should be a teacher, I think, means you might go, okay, well, actually, my teaching assistant team is wonderful. I'm going to use these 3 members of staff because I trust them implicitly and they know exactly what's going on. And I think if you've got a good relationship with the parents and the TAs know those students well, and you've prepped those TAs for the conversation they're going to have, actually, I would say that's totally acceptable, with those caveats in mind, or provisos in mind. But it doesn't have to be you. And actually, in one of the schools I work in, I think there's a sort of some over identification historically. There's over 200 students on the SEND register. How is that possible? Well, we're designing a bit of using form tutors essentially, and looking at how can we use form tutors to have really good and really informed conversations with parents, where there's of course a box of, do you require a follow-up with the SENCO? So there's still access to you, but it doesn't necessarily have to be you. In person, so I spoke to the wonderful lady from Chatterpack, whose name escapes me, and that's really bad because she was very helpful. But anyway, it might come to me about, I wrote some questions, just like I did with IPSI around the law. I wrote some questions around working with parents and said, I'd really love your thoughts on the answers I've written, and whether, and she rapped me on the knuckles a couple of times and said, that's not, that's probably a bit condescending to parents. And I, held my hands up and said, yeah, that's poorly phrased, I suppose. But she made the point very helpfully that they don't always need to be in person, these meetings, that some people might prefer over Teams, Zoom, or over the phone. Some people really value in person, and that should be noted. But that partly is tied into reasonable adjustments for parents, and thinking actually what's the way we can communicate that is the most comfortable and acceptable, and going to help you to have the most positive experience of this meeting. I then talk about sort of rigidity, really. So Claire Ryan, thank you. Yes, absolutely. So it doesn't need to be, so 3 times a year suggests that things are very much on the school's terms, I feel. And actually, I think it is most useful to go, these are our 3 formal times a year, but not to limit it at that, and actually to have a sort of parent surgery slot, and to make it very explicit how parents can book a slot with you. And it might be 2 20-minute sessions a week, one's sort of at pickup time and one's at drop-off time ish, and they're on different days, and parents can always book them so that they sort of know that your door's always open without you needing to be available at all points in the week. So actually not being rigidly, well, we meet with, if someone phones you, well, I'll meet you in February because that's when I meet with parents. Clearly we move beyond that. And then I talk about using school systems. So actually your systems of meeting parents 3 times a year. Actually, I think there'll be many on the call who utilise parents' evenings when parents are in or in contact with the school anyway, rather than setting up something separate. And equally, if lots of parents are coming in for another reason, for other sort of school events, actually being around and being able to either have an appointment or just grab a parent and say how well their son's doing in this and how pleased you are. Actually, that's all incredibly valid communication as well, of course. I then talk a bit in the book about effective parent partnership. I wrote my master's dissertation on this, and so this is some of the answers are very much based on, this is my experience and I hope it's everyone else's. Some are based on using lots of other people that I've worked with or researching. This one is about sort of academic study particularly. So the excuse me, in my dissertation and all the research I did and focus groups and all that sort of reading I did for it, found particularly that it's about ensuring the basics are done well, and actually parents get the most. It's not necessarily about going straight to co-production of our provision. The first thing is, do parents know what provision's in place? Are we meeting them 3 times a year to discuss what information we believe is true about their child and what strategies we believe and approaches we believe are useful for their child? And then likewise around any intervention. So I would call those the basics of communication. I'm not saying that means they're easy, because of course the bigger you send register, the harder that is. And some parents, of course, don't engage easily with school. Their experiences of school may not be positive generally, but I'd call those the basics, and it's really about getting those right. It's then moving beyond 3 times a year. That the message I had very loudly and clearly was 3 times a year isn't enough. And that doesn't mean scheduling something that's enormous and rigorous, 8 or 15 times a year. But I think it means knowing that parents can find you or can have other opportunities to see you at other times. And whether that's because you're there at whole school events, or whether you put on a coffee morning where we can all talk about how the year 7s are finding being in year 7, or the year 11s are finding the anxiety around exams, for example. So it's 3 times a year, but there's also other ways in which parents can have a conversation with you, where it's not only this is how your child is doing, full stop. It's educating and supporting parents where possible, but of course it's also about listening to parents and appreciating that they are the people who will always have. I was told this several years ago, and I found it to be always true. Parents always have their best interests of their child at heart. I think it's an excellent sort of ethos, and I think we all met parents where we go, surely not. But actually, I think assuming that parents have their best interests of the children at heart and are doing the best they can by their children is a more useful sort of philosophy, and the one I try to approach with. But also, of course, parents, it may be that parents need your support, need you to signpost them to organisations, or need to be clued up themselves around autism or dyslexia or whatever it is that we're trying to support their child with in school. We should be using parents, so using parents to spread positive messages about what you're doing where possible, and to think if there's an intervention that's taking place, actually what can the parent be doing at home with the child to try and extend the benefit of that intervention as well. And then co-produce, as I mentioned a moment ago, where have discussions with all parents or a group of parents about what we want to do, how we're trying to drive and move things forward, what we think is true about our provision, for them to say, well, hang on a minute, that's nonsense. Actually, parents aren't happy with this, or our children report that. So many ways to have effective parent partnership. It can take a lot of time, and actually it could be all you do, and that's the trickiest thing I think as a SENCO is finding that balance of finding ways to go, I want my parent partnership to be as good as as excellent, as gold standard as possible, but not at the expense of everything, just having balance in that role, which I think can be really tough. And I hope the time that might be saved by this book helps that in some small way. I also ask in the book what are the most effective things that parents can do to help their child, which is sort of based on research around effective parental things. It essentially says that parents are useful in every way except doing homework for their kids, but there are some more nuanced advice in there as well. The next thing just to hone in on a bit is about trainees. So I talk in the book about these getting trainees in these areas on this slide, and how that can be really adding to your provision. So in particular, for me, we've worked with volunteer counsellors. Counsellors need, to be a qualified counsellor, you need X amount of hours. It's like trying to be a pilot, isn't it? You need X amount of hours of practice or of sessions in order to get your BACP registration or whatever registration accreditation you're going for. And so we can use that as SENCOs, and we need to appreciate that these people are trainees, and therefore what is their supervision look like? What does their training and support and guidance look like? They're likely to be young in their careers. But actually, as long as certain things are in place, that can be an enormously wonderful resource. We have trainee social workers in several of our schools, and the way we've done that is just to approach, find out who the local provider is, send them an email. We're a school, we're interested in working with you. What can you provide? And now we've just had some second year bachelor students working in 2 of our schools. We're going to have some second year master's students working in it's a 2-year master's, second year master's students working in some of our schools. They do 70-day placement, so they're not there forever, but it's in 14 weeks is enough to make a good mark on some families and some young people. Work with apprentice TAs as well, which has been very helpful. But I've tried to go there's some detail. This is just taken from the book about, lots of it is just here's the website where you can find out who the training provider is, and then work out which one's closest to your school, and then just get in touch with them and see if they're looking for placement providers. I know there are universities that really struggle to find placement providers, schools essentially. So for EPs, it's aep.org.uk. Find out who your local service is and go, hello, Anna Freud Centre, or hello, Institute of Education, or whoever it is. Are you looking for, and there may be some cost. It's likely to be a lot less than it would be if you were having a qualified EP. And then there are questions about the quality, questions about the support they need, the supervision, etc. But the university should be able to help you with all of those things, of course. Likewise for counsellors, so feel free, if it's helpful, to screen grab this. If you haven't got the book, feel free to screenshot these pages if they're big enough to be useful. Trainee counsellors, so on the BACP have a database, and you can find a list of training providers there, just going, we've got kids who benefit from counselling. Can you help us? Do you need some placements? Likewise, speech and language therapists. So find out which universities offer accredited speech and language therapy training. Get in touch with that uni. Likewise with social workers. Likewise with special teachers through the British Dyslexia Association. They hold a list of university providers who for whom people train to be a specialist teacher. Likewise, TAs, often your local sort of colleges and universities will offer TA training, or colleges really, level 2 and level 3 TA training, and they will need hours. So some people do it while they're already employed in a TA job, so the hours that they're doing in their role sort of count as those practice hours really. But actually some people will do that without having a job, as a way to try and get a job, and they will need placements, and so you're able to provide that for them. And again, thinking about the level of support they'll need. And then apprentices, so there's a find apprenticeship service.gov.uk. So largely with TAs, I haven't got experience of looking for people to work within an inclusion department outside of the TA role. Maybe there are others I'm not thinking of, but certainly some potential use there. And then EMHPs, I'm annoyed I couldn't find a database, which is why this sits slightly separately in the book. But education mental health practitioners, so you may well work with them already, but in case you don't know what they are sort of ways to try and do some pre-CAMS work really, and keep kids out of the CAMS service, and also to allow a bit more of that work to happen in schools rather than in clinics, where it can be a bit of a barrier for the child to go there, maybe for the parent to take them. And actually, if you can avoid that barrier by the work happening in school and happening at an earlier stage, that's great. They don't only do one-to-one counselling, they can do group sessions, whole class work, work around transition, work with staff, and there are trainee EMHPs, education mental health practitioners, and there are those who are qualified, and both of them need placements. I don't understand all of the funding behind it, but there is funding that means that often it is totally free for schools. And in my experience, it's free for schools. So you'll get someone 1 day a week, and all their sort of training and support is provided by whoever coordinates it in that area. So on this one, see Chesworth in particular, I assume you're talking about the EMHPs there. So Mind have the contract for some of these education mental health practitioners. So within the London boroughs of London that I work in, Mind have the contract. So the local sort of branch of Mind will know, yes, we're recruiting for EMHP, for schools to host EMHPs at the moment, or no, we're not, but we'll put you on the waiting list. In the schools I work in Hertfordshire, it's not Mind, it's with the local NHS trust, I think. And so again, I don't understand the bidding process here, but in different localities, Abigail, feel free, please chip in if you've got experience of this, but or anyone on the call. But different localities will have different people managing the EMHPs, or education mental health practitioners. They don't have capacity to work in every single school in the country, but they, you know, in my experience, they have capacity to work in a number of schools in every area that I've worked in, and so they're a wonderful resource if you can get one. It's not, there's no database there. That's the problem. I haven't found a central list of who manages it in each area. So I'd be going to your NHS contact within health, probably. Well, obviously within health, but an NHS contact you have, even if it's within the speech language therapy service, just as a sort of way into the right email address. Or if you have a contact with Mind, ask if they happen to do it in that area. Abigail, anything to chip in there?
No, I think it varies from local authority. So it's just a case of finding what your authority process says.
Yeah. So that's the other thing, of course. Go to your SEND contact at your local authority and say who has the contract for EMHPs in this area. And if they look at you blankly, ask someone else at the local authority, and you might get there. And they're free. In my experience, they're free. I don't want to make a promise that where you are they will be free, but in my experiences in 3 different London boroughs and in the county of Hertfordshire, totally free, because it's a funded service through government, I suppose. To, you know, when government say we've put more money into mental health, and you go, well, I haven't seen it, where's that? Because they're certainly not seeing that at the chalk face. And actually, this may be one of those ways where actually those earlier intervention and happening in school, supported by, you know, an adult who knows them well, is able to get them into the room rather than difficulties of getting them to a clinic. So it's a great thing, and it is free in my experience. And then the last thing I thought I'd talk. Oh, we've got a hand up. I'm happy to pause, take a question. Ruth, is it? Abigail, I'll let you be the arbiter of who gets to talk first. So then there's a hand gone down.
There's a hand gone. I need to find it.
Don't worry.
A second.
No problem.
Martha, no, Mike.
Don't worry. Do you know what, let's hold on 5 minutes. If that question can wait a moment anyway, that'd be great. But I'd love to take it in a second. The next thing, I put this picture of a cake on. Well, firstly, because cake is lovely, and secondly, because I use it as an analogy for interventions, where if we get the teaching and learning right, lots of other things don't need to happen. And specifically with interventions, I think we've got to treat them as the icing on the cake and not the cake itself. So when I started as a SENCO role, and I was really finding it very difficult to influence this English teacher's practice because I wasn't skilled enough myself to do that. It was like, let's get all my interventions right because that feels easier. So I'll make sure there's a really good program of interventions. And it meant this one child might have had 2 really great 20-minute slots per week, but I didn't do anything to impact on the 6 lessons a day that they have. And clearly, interventions have got to be the icing on the cake and not the cake itself. And we can say it's just high quality teaching, but as SENCOs, really, we need to support teachers with what that means. And I think I've certainly been guilty of not really knowing what that means, and certainly not being able to articulate what that means clearly. So the things I put on that slide there, SENCOs can do, you know, we need to, of course we do, we need to set up interventions, make ECP applications, promote strategies to manage challenging behaviour, have lots of parent meetings, wean a child off TA support. But actually, if we get the teaching and learning right, all of those things are needed less. I'm not saying we don't meet parents if we get the teaching right, you know, but all those things are needed less. We can go back to 3 times a year, maybe, for parents, rather than phoning a parent phoning every week because they're not happy with the teaching their child's getting. So getting the teaching and learning right is the cake, as far as I see it. And so I talk, so one example there in the book is about teacher exposition, and what should we be saying to all teachers, really, probably regardless of subject or phase, actually, from early years to right through. What should we be saying? I've tried to put a few quick wins as a SENCO where you might get these out, right, 5 or 6 things. I can just put it in an email or go and give it in feedback to teachers. Pre-teach vocabulary is one thing. If you're going to go through lots of difficult words in your exposition, in your teacher talk, teach a few of those keywords first. And I also do cover in the book about how to teach vocabulary, but you'll know that already. I'm sure. Dual code, have some appropriate, helpful and linked images to the content that you're saying, because many students with SEND have they struggle with language. They struggle when the language gets too complex or when they're relying only on words. Having a relevant and useful and linked visual can be a really helpful way for some students with SEND to retain that, to understand that concept and then ultimately retain it. Stop, I think, is one essential bit of feedback to give to teachers about their exposition. It's about the power of just saying something, an important bit of information, and then just pausing, because inevitably a few of the kids would have, there'll be someone staring out the window, irrespective of their SEND status, and actually stopping and then probably repeating it, and then maybe asking one student to repeat it back, or rephrasing it slightly as a question and asking another student. So just the power of stopping. And then what you do in that stop, there's a few options, but just the power of not talking and talking and talking is really useful information to give to teachers about their exposition, I feel. The providing thinking time, of course, ask a question, stop, a bit of thinking time. Chunking information, so I'm not teaching it all in one go. I'm teaching it related to a specific, something I want to cover today. I'll just do just that, and then I'll stop. We'll have a bit of questioning, might do a bit of written work, and then we maybe come back to the next bit. So it's not too much all at once. And then when I'm talking, I link it to the learning outcomes. I'm not just using 10,000 words to show off my own subject knowledge. I'm actually linking it very closely to what the students need to know. I'm not wasting words. Final cheeky request before I get to questions and things. If you're happy to leave a very quick Amazon review, I'd really appreciate it. I hope it's okay for the link. Oh, Abigail, that's very useful. There will be an EMHP register, but it hasn't been released yet. Either you knew that already, Abigail, or you should be a detective. That's really wonderful. Thank you. Okay, thank you. I shall have a look at that after the call. Thanks. But if anyone is happy just to leave a little, even just a few stars or a little, this was good, I'd appreciate it. If I from this book, I make £2.60 if someone buys a book, I think, which will be for over a year's work. I don't think he's going to make me a millionaire. So I have to believe, although it's nice and thank you, I have to believe that the reason to have done it is because I think it'll be helpful to SENCOs. And so if it is, I'd be very grateful if you could tell others, but also pop it on Amazon, because I believe the more reviews, then it appears a bit higher up in searches than things I don't understand. But thank you. And Abigail, if that's right, to put the link to the Amazon page in the chat, I'd be very grateful. Thank you. If you work with a number of schools, so in a MAT or local authority, and you'd consider, or they might consider, buying copies, John Catt have agreed that we can do discounts and things. So just let me know and I'll arrange a discount. So please, just my email's there. If you think, yeah, I'm in a MAT and I want to tell my MAT SEND lead about this. Oh, thanks, Abigail, that's kind. Or I lead SEND within a local authority, or I work very closely with a local authority SEND lead, and they might want to know about it. John Catt will send some copies out, or offer discounts for loads of copies. So just let me know if you think this would be useful for people, but it's the £13 or whatever it is a bit of a barrier. I'm sure that can be got around. And then finally, if you like the book, please tell others about it. Again, for that reason that it's nice if more people if I can provide a shortcut to more people, that's really nice. I'm really grateful for any positive feedback people have put on Facebook or Twitter or Amazon, whatever, so far. It's just really, those late nights and early mornings and whatever, just make me very pleased that that's been something useful to throw into the mix, the enormous mix of SEND and SENCO books that already exist. So really an enormous thank you for your time. I know that we're finishing at 5, so now I'm opening up, I think, Abigail, you guide me, but I'm opening up, I think, to anyone's questions. And Abigail, you might, if you could introduce how this will run, or just how you want it to happen, please share.
The best way to ask questions, just mute yourself for a second, Gary, sorry. Thank you. Best way to ask questions is to throw it in the chat, because trying to find your names in that very long list and unmute each individual is probably going to take me several hours, never mind minutes. However, I do need to get Gary to do something, because John Catt very kindly sent me a copy of the Lone SENCO, and I'd already bought my copy, so I'm sorry, I don't need 2 copies, Gary. So if you'd like to scroll down the participant list and pick somebody, I will get this posted out to them as a bit of a prize for joining us today. Hopefully they don't already have a copy as well, though.
That feels horrible. What? I'll just scroll up and down and, you know, all right, I move my cursor around randomly and it stopped on Farah Tahikeli. I'm sorry, anyone else who and Farah, I hope that's an acceptable way to have done that. I promise anyone I'm not related to and don't know Farah. There's no no corruption going on here.
It's the most sensible way of doing it, I'm afraid. So yeah, Farah, I will message you via Facebook, hopefully. If not, I'll find your email on Eventbrite, drop you an email, and if you reply with your address, I will get that posted out to you. So I'm going to find my chat button and see if anybody's got any questions for you, Gary. They're not typing at the moment. Oh, you mentioned an over-reliance on LSA support. Can you give advice on how to manage an LSA who will not allow the SEN child to be independent? She will not leave their side.
Yeah, so 2 things, Nikki, that I'll share. Thanks for your question, and I hope these things are useful. So one feels a bit punitive, and the other is a nice bit of support and development for the SENCO, for the TA potentially. So the punitive one first is I felt I work across a number of schools and I know what I want, and I assume that everyone else knows what I want, and often they don't. And what I want, I'm fairly confident is linked to what works, I hope, and what the evidence suggests is good, and all the stuff, you know, the MITRE project and all this evidence around TAs. But so I articulated that, thanks, Farah. I articulated that as 8 TA standards. That might feel a bit punitive, and you need to consider your own relationship with your TAs and whatever, but it was taken from the DFE's TA standards, which aren't statutory but exist. I cut them down slightly to the ones that I think link most closely to our sort of trusts, pedagogy and ethos, and link most closely to the change I need to see sometimes from some of the SENCOs, certainly about independence. And then I just made that really clear, gave a training to all the TAs in the trust over Teams about why, that they're not trying to catch anyone out, that they're based by what the evidence suggests works well, and that when anyone drops into your class to see you, this is the aim, that they see you doing these things. But also it's not just about observation, it's about please try and embody and walk these, because they're good and they're going to help our students. So the first one feels a bit punitive, but it's about articulating some TA standards, if you like. And Nikki, I'm very happy. My email address is on that slide. If you email me, I'll happily send them to you. And then the second thing is about metacognition, and the EEF's SEN and Mainstream Guidance Report talks about metacognition as a good approach that works for students to SEND. And I've got some, I've written a bit of a thing which I'll happily share with you, Nikki, over email about how, I mean, TAs are so well placed to promote metacognitive thinking, because they're the ones next to the kid with the option of either I'll tell you the answer or I'll support you to get to the answer. So doing things about you know, being able to say, what strategy are you going to use to help you with this, or how well are you focusing on this task at the moment? That all promotes metacognitive thinking, which the EEF Teaching and Learning Toolkit says works for everyone. And their SEN and Mainstream Guidance Report explicitly shows that the evidence shows that that's a good approach to take for students to SEND as well. So one is a bit of training around TAs, around metacognition, so that it's not the spoon feed, it's the ask the right questions. And the other is slightly more punitive, just really clearly articulating through, call them standards, call them whatever, put them on a observation feedback form instead, if you want, however you want to do it, but just as a way to be very explicit about what you're looking for. Thanks, Sarah, that's really kind feedback, and I've just seen Abigail's put the link to my blog on there. Thank you very much. I'm just seeing Louise's question. Abigail, should I come to that next?
Yep, so Louise said, one of the biggest concerns at the moment is around anxiety and non-attendance. We're not able to support as I think we should due to limited resources. Any advice, as there is a long waiting list for CAMS, but parents want solutions.
Yeah, so tricky. So it's a challenge at the moment everywhere. And the first thing to say is that on the 20th of January, the DFE did a bit of a line in the sand about attendance, and it showed that national attendance at the moment is 87%. For students with the EHCPs, it's 82%. So if there's a little bit of not beating yourself up because it's rubbish everywhere, I know what we want is our students to be in school, and so accepting them not being in school isn't the answer. But if it sort of gives you a bit of reassurance about all the hard work you're doing and not seeing us back up to 92%, whatever, that is a problem that is not unique just to one school. Yeah, so the approach that we've taken in our trust around attendance is a few things really. So partly it's about bespoke sort of key working. So it's finding out the reasons behind that child's non-attendance. That is often quite individual, and the solution will often be unique to them. So it could be about a different entrance to this, using the staff entrance, the main reception instead of the student entrance into the playground in the morning. It could be about something you provide at break or lunchtime. It could be about a particular lesson sitting next to a particular child. It could be about the way a particular the head of year speaks to them. It could be, of course, about anything. And the way I think to uncover that is to ask parents, ask the child, but also a bit of key working. So what we've done in some of our schools is give each TA sort of a key person, sort of 5 or 6 students within a year group who are on the SEND register, whose attendance isn't quite what it should be. We haven't gone with the sort of 0%ers or the chronic, they're having enormous amounts of support from because of quite chronic medical needs. But we've gone with the I'm stuck at about 80-85% and a bit of key working to uncover what the individual thing is there. We also try to reward improvements to attendance, not just 100% attendance. So if a child goes up from 60% last term to 85% this term, we try and acknowledge that as an improvement to their attendance and make sure that we recognise those things. And we get better with data tracking so that if children aren't coming in, we know it. And that for example, there might be a member of staff, administrative staff, who sends the SENCO the attendance data for the last week on a Friday. The SENCO identifies 2 or 3 actions that they'll take on the Monday to try and support that. And the last thing I say on attendance is 4 o'clock phone calls. So rather than just typically, the advice around attendance is about same day phone calls. And I think child isn't in. Hello, where are they? Oh, they're ill. Okay, thanks, bye. And actually that has a place because it shows that we notice they're not there. But actually we get our teaching assistants where they're employed until beyond 3:15 and where they're not running interventions after school. We'll ask them to do some phone calls, or the SENCO will do them potentially as well, around this student wasn't in, we notice you weren't in today, just checking if you're feeling okay about tomorrow, about coming back in. Do you want to come and see me in the morning before you go to period 1? And so we've tried 4 o'clock phone calls as a way to not be badgering, and it's not appropriate in all cases, but sometimes it's useful and a nice reminder that we've missed you, you've had a whole day to think about not being in school, just checking that you're okay for tomorrow, and if you're not, let's talk about why. Hope that answers that adequately. Where am I next, Abigail?
Okay, I was just going to pick up on the TA standards. We've put the link to the original TA standards in the side for people. They were not adopted, so that they were written in 2016. They were never actually officially adopted, but they are the only thing that we have available for TAs. Just to be aware that if you're looking at apprenticeship standards, or if you're looking at cash qualifications and VQs and all that, those standards don't quite align. They are slightly different, but pretty much you can match them. And that if you don't want to download it as a PDF file, Focus Education, and you can see that Focus Education actually do a lovely little spiral bound one, which is written almost like a CPD log, so the TA can go down and actually log what they're doing against each of those things, which is really great if you've got somebody who can be a little more challenging, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say. So we've got 2 more questions have popped up that I saw. Any advice on managing up? So the SLT seem to be committed to SEND, but what I do doesn't get fed back to the governors, and I'm worried about the Ofsted take on this. Love the book, it's helping in so many ways.
Yeah, that's really kind. Thank you for that feedback. Really appreciate it. I'm just finding your question here again, so I've got it in front of me. Sorry. Yeah, so that's that's really good news about SLT. Schools don't have to have a SEND link governor. It's considered good practice, and the SEND code of practice said that there should be a governor assigned to SEND. So it doesn't say it needs to be, but I think the closer you can develop a relationship with one governor in particular, the better. I led a presentation for our governors in our trust yesterday around and some SEND link governors and some not. But I think that what if I understand that correctly, it's that you would like a closer relationship with your governor in particular, and I think it's you going to your head teacher and going, you know, I'm worried about governance and SEND. Now, I think if the governors don't know, you know, if the governors are a bit unskilled about SEND, that's going to reflect worse on the head than it is on you. It's going to reflect worse on the governors, but also I think there's a bit of a jump there. It's very unlikely to reflect badly on you as SENCO if the governors don't know quite what they're talking about SEND. But I think also wherever it's enough, whenever people opt out when they feel insecure about things, don't they? And when they feel that knowing about it is insurmountable. So I think if you can make a really clear, explicit offer of support of if you're a governor who's interested in SEND, maybe they're not ready to take on responsibility for it, but if you're a governor who's interested in SEND, I'd love to meet you to talk about the context here, what provisions we have, the way we try and develop our teachers and teaching assistants, and the great progress that some of our students are making, and some of the challenges as well. So I think it's going to your head and saying, can I have a governor? And whether they become a formal SENDLink governor or whether they just become someone who you have a relationship with, actually it becomes not you want the challenge and scrutiny necessarily. The first step will be, let me help a governor to be skilled up in the case of Ofsted, but also in the case of good governance. And then obviously as that relationship develops, you then have someone in the governing body who can hold your head and SLT to account if it comes to it. It sounds like you've got an incredibly supportive head, but you know, if heads are ultimately answerable to governors, then having a governor who knows what questions to ask, I've found can be really helpful at keeping SEND on the radar, on the agenda.
Thanks, Gary. So we've got 3 more questions for you. A really useful session, thank you. I'd like some advice on supporting a new Year 5 child who has arrived from a different borough with 0 support and no external agencies, including social services attached from a previous school and borough. He has SEMH difficulties and cognitive difficulties, massive gaps in learning, and is very violent, over 30 incidents since the 5th of January. We've started from scratch, CDC, SALT outreach, starting off with consistency, routine, attention and listening, safe adults, early days. I suppose Sabrina's saying, what next?
Yeah, Sabrina, that's really tough. We've been in the same situation at school ourselves, where a child really should have had all this work happen in their previous locality for many reasons. Often they didn't. And for that child to be in Year 5 and still not have that in place, seems really sad. So a few things. I'd be going to the local authority and saying, I know that an EHCP process is 20 weeks, and let's be honest, often it's longer, but can you please, take heed of this case and put them to the top of your, get them straight to panel, get them straight to the top of the EP's list, for example, because there's a real, there's a risk of permanent exclusion here. And I think that often gets a bit of, where behaviours, it shouldn't really. The child who's struggling just as much but sitting silently should be as much of a concern. But let's be honest, where permanent exclusions and things, I know you haven't talked about that, but where that's a road that could be gone down potentially if this continues, actually, the local authority have a duty for that child not to take a place in an expensive PRU or to stay out of that system where possible. So it should be in their interest to fast track that as if possible. And in Chapter 6 of the Code of Practice, it talks about 20 weeks, but there may be reasons why it needs to be quicker or something along those lines. It's written in the book. So, and obviously it's on the Code of Practice. So please just maybe find that and use that line in the Code of Practice to say, look, sometimes there is the need for it to be faster than 20 weeks. Please listen to me here. I don't know what authority you're in clearly, but I hope that's one thing I do. The other thing is, obviously you have a notional budget as a SEND notional budget as a school. And we all know that money doesn't sort of really exist, does it? It's not, it doesn't, but it's not ring fenced. So it's sort of spent before it's even received in some ways, because, it goes out to yours, a bit of your salary, SENCO, a bit of whatever. But I'd be going, if it is, I know an extra adult doesn't solve the problem, but is often an essential help where the sort of the level of difficulties you're talking about, and actually being able to get someone in to be a close support to that child, even if not one-to-one, and use some of the notional budget there. I'd be pressing your school leads to say, look at, if we can find this in the budget, look at the benefit for all students, and especially for that key student. Some local authorities have mechanisms of getting shorter term funding than a 20-week EHCP process. It's worth inquiring if they do. I know I've worked for a long time in Westminster where they did have contingency funding and they stopped it. So there wouldn't be a solution there. It isn't in every borough or local authority, but it's worth asking. And the last is about the problem is often these things don't go well for so long because we're waiting for recommendations, when often and reports, and often they tell us what we know already in some variety, or they just sort of tell us back what we've told them. You know, you do a questionnaire to the CDC, and when you read the report, it's sort of the things that you've told them. So actually, if you can get a day of an EP service and pay for it as a school from your local authority, that might be money well spent to get that advice really quickly. I mean, you know, commissioning it, paying for it, rather than it being just part of the service. But again, that may be a really useful bit of money. Or it's about backing yourself, Sabrina, and your colleagues. Oh, sorry, advisory teachers from the local authority may be relevant to where you are. Say, you know, we haven't got an official diagnosis yet, but we need you to meet this child, please. We strongly suspect they have X or Y. Please come and help us now. And then lastly, Sabrina, it's about, you know, backing yourself and going, okay, let's just treat let's treat this boy as a child who's finding school difficult first and foremost. And we think, okay, what works for children when they're finding things difficult, irrespective of SEND needs? Well, actually, it's about trusted relationships with adults, for example. So how can we build that sense of trust from that child to the key adults who work with them? We know that managing cognitive load, I don't know about this boy's academic abilities, but it could be that they're finding the academic work too difficult. So actually, how can we reduce the cognitive load for the whole class, including for that child? And I know I've referenced the EEF, and it is a sort of loaded thing because I work for them 2 days a week, but you know, there's some good things around learning behaviors on the EEF website that show that sort of the point it makes is don't treat SEND in isolation. Other things will be relevant. I'm happy to send over some slides to anyone. You've got the various things that people have made requests on, and I can't, if I can link it to the chat, I would. I don't think I can, but if you can please just send me an email, and the things that you've put on the chat or requested, I'll very happily, it might take me a few days, but I will respond with a particular resource or something.
To make it a little easier for you, Gary, if you email them to me, I'll put them on the Voomly link and everybody can access them from there. Probably quicker and easier.
That's great. Then I'll quickly write down what they are. Thank you. Yeah, thanks. Any other questions, Abigail? Sorry.
We've got 2 more. So, and some of you said thank you very much. It's been very insightful. So one person said, I work in a school where some teachers don't read the grids for learning and lessons don't take into account the children's learning needs. How do we encourage reluctant teachers to work with these students? And they've added it secondary. Unmute.
You. Okay, first of all, I've got to an hour without that problem so far. Thanks. Okay, so I think the first thing is a bit of self-reflection of and I have no grounds at all to criticize, and I don't mean to, but the questions that I'd be asking first if it was a SENCO I worked with in our trust is things like the information you're giving, is it overwhelming? Is it really easily accessible? Is it sort of, you know, bite size, if you like? Is it, you know, all things that feel implementable, or is it 5 strategies for dyslexia, 5 strategies for communication needs, 5 strategies for you know, moderate learning difficulties? And actually, teachers can feel overwhelmed, or they can feel like they have to read, you know, 2, 3, 4 pages about every child on the SEND register. And I don't even know clearly if you're primary or secondary, but a secondary art teacher would teach, you know, 8, 9, 10, 11 classes. They might have 50 students, 40 students across their week with SEND, and clearly doing something that's very bespoke to each of them is difficult. So I would be saying it's about working, firstly looking at, you know, how have I been given training time? So if there is a really nice, accessible 1-ish page summary of children's needs and strategies for each child, then absolutely we should be expecting teachers to read it and implement it. But I'd be saying 2 things. 1, can we do it in directed time? So can you go to your head or senior leader who looks at CPD? The biggest win I've had is when we've gone, we're going to print out these things rather than just saying find them on this subfolder on the system. Print them out, sorry trees, but we find, you know, every so often I think it needs to be done. And in directed time, we're all sitting in the hall, or people are in departments if that's more appropriate, and we have them printed, and you now have 45 minutes. No one leaves the room. We're going through them. You know, you sit quietly and read them. And if you want to raise a question, say, what does this mean? Or say, this is difficult in practice, or actually, I do this for this child, maybe add that, and it becomes something quite collaborative, but do it while people are in the room, because it's a professional, it should be a professional expectation that everyone does it, but inevitably the teachers who you need to be doing it may be less inclined to make the time to do it. The teachers you need, you know, and some teachers who are doing it anyway. So I think directed time is the key, and printed out is the key for what it's worth. I hope it is in your setting. And I was going to say, just the step before going to really specific things. Again, EEF, sorry for the plug, but the EEF research around SEND found that actually what works for a lot of learners without SEND also works with SEND. So it's about explicit instruction, cognitive and metacognitive strategies, for example. And actually, if we can get more teachers to meet the needs at the whole class level through the way they question, the way they use their exposition, the way they support during independent practice, if we can get them the environment they set up in the classroom, if we can meet more needs at the whole class level, then teachers don't get overwhelmed with going 5 strategies for him, 3 strategies for her, 5 strategies for that need type, because it's met at the universal level. And I think that's what getting closer towards universal level means, that if, okay, this child needs a size 28 font because they've got a visual impairment, this child needs a now an X board on their desk because of that's their need related to their autism, then they have the headspace to do those minor adaptations because they're not being asked to do lots of adaptations for 7 different children in one class. No criticism intended. Clearly, I don't know anything about your school, but I hope that's useful.
Thank you very much, Gary. Yeah, you're absolutely right. They don't have time to read it sometimes. There's just too much information and too many to remember. So somebody sent me one by email. They were struggling to put it in the chat, and I've got my emails open. I'm sure most schools are looking to have interventions delivered by fully trained, experienced therapists. Are there any ethical issues to consider when using trainees to work with children with SEND?
Yeah, I think, but the heartening thing is always to be guided by the organisation that's sending you the trainee. So they will have a level of professional support, and obviously if it's something like counselling, there's clear, what's their training, what's their ongoing supervision, and also then how it may need to take a bit more of your time as SENCO to check in with them regularly, not to provide clinical supervision, but just a bit of a how are you and how can we help you, rather than if they were fully qualified and they can be left to their own devices a little bit. So clearly there are implications, but I think anything around the ethics of it, I think we can quite happily leave to the professional institution that they're linked to and come from. In terms of the quality of what they provide, clearly you wouldn't put a trainee with your most complex sort of, someone may still need a CAMS worker, a qualified psychologist to be working with them weekly. And so you'll just think about the balance of students' needs and what's going to be helpful for them. Carrie put something on there about the dialogue. Please just clarify what you mean there, Carrie, and I'll make sure I provide it if I can. I wasn't sure what that was referring to. Sorry.
So I've forgotten what I was going to say then. Yeah. Sorry. Thank you very much, Gary. That's been absolutely wonderful. I think lots of positive comments there on the side for you. I'll try and pull the chat off at the end. Carrie said the EEF stuff regarding meeting the needs of the whole class.
Oh, yeah. I'll send a few things over to Abigail, and Abigail will do wonderful things with it, I'm sure.
We'll do something with it. So I'd like to say thank you to you, and thank you to everybody for coming tonight. It has been incredibly useful, Gary. I think everybody would agree with that. Can I remind everybody, I think you can probably see on the husband's slide, husband's just posted it for us as well. We have got another network meeting at 7 o'clock tonight, which is with NICI. So if you're struggling to get some of your students into school, do come and join us. They're going to talk to us about some of the things that they've got available. And we've got another 2 network meetings this month to go with that. I've forgotten what they're about. So we've got the VR Mind, who are going to talk to us about artificial intelligence and augmented reality, and using that to support students with SEMH. And we also have the rather wonderful David Bartram at the end of the month is going to talk about 10 effective principles of SEND self-evaluation, and that one's definitely worth attending, because only those who are live in the chat will get the free gift that comes with attendance. I'm going to say no more than that. But thank you to everybody. Like I say, this has been recorded. We'll make sure everybody gets that sorted out. And thank you so much, Gary, for your time this afternoon answering those questions.
Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate your time. Thank you much. Appreciate the feedback as well.